Come with me as I walk across the Alps in the footsteps of Napoleon. 5 days, 75 kilometres, some 2,000 metres, and I'm following the exact route that Napoleon took when he took his army over the Alps to outflank the Austrians in May 1800. I'll be going from Martigny in Switzerland to Aosta in Italy, where I will then get a bus home, unless obviously I decide to go rampaging through Italy to pick a fight with some Austrians, which is always possible. Along the way, I'm going to tell you about a few of the books that have informed this walk, and it's going to be epic, or it's going to be a completely epic fail, and I'll end up checking into some terrible Swiss spa hotel and weeping into my fondue. But you will only know if you come with me, so let's go. At the beginning of 1800, Napoleon, newly made first consul, was beginning to prepare for hostilities with Austria. He ordered the formation of a reserve army, about 30,000 strong, at Dijon, and his plan was to surprise the Austrians by taking an army over the Alps through the St. Bernard Pass, a feat no one had done since Charlemagne, and certainly not with the type of heavy artillery that he would need to beat the Austrians. He chose the St. Bernard Pass, helpfully pointed out here by Augustus. It's an old Roman route through the mountains, which became, and still is, part of a pilgrimage route called the Via Francigena, which stretches from Canterbury to Rome. He had to get 51,000 men, 10,000 horses, 750 mules, supplies, artillery, and himself over those hills. And I just had to get me across, and a rucksack, and my dodgy knee, and it looks quite high, and that's just day one. So I haven't been going very long on my epic walk, and the weather has completely closed in. So I found this shelter, and I'm just stopping for a minute to have my breakfast. And I thought while I was stopped for breakfast, I'll tell you a little bit about the books that are going to be my guides for this walk. So the first two are pretty obvious. The brilliant Andrew Roberts and Adam Zamoyski, who both wrote fantastic biographies of Napoleon. So almost everything that I'm going to tell you that sounds authentic and true is actually from them, not from me. So there we go. Great books. I particularly love Andrew Roberts' account of this bit that I'm about to do. The other book I've got is absolutely the most awesome thing. So it's the memoirs of a guy called Captain Coignet. I think his name is Jean-Roch Coignet. Instantly, I cannot do foreign voices. I'm too English. I'm sorry. So apologies. I'm trained. Anyway, so Captain Coignet, he is 24 when the events of this book happen. He's only recently joined the army. He adores Napoleon, thinks he's absolutely marvellous. And he is an illiterate peasant. He only learns to read and write when he's 35, which is amazing. And later on, he writes these memoirs when he's in his 70s. So it's possible, obviously, that they're elaborated, or he's misremembering, but there's lots of amazing detail. So, you know, as with all historical memoirs, pinch of salt, but such great stuff. And Captain Coignet takes us from Martigny all the way across to Aosta, and he has a pretty torrid time of it. And I'm going to tell you about his time as I go, hoping that my time is not quite as torrid. Now, I am doing it in August, not August, July. I am doing it in July. So the weather will be substantially better. So when they did it in May, there was ice and snow at the top. And if you imagine they're trying to carry their massive field artillery across the Alps, and I've just got my rucksack, and that feels like enough already. So Captain Coignet and his pals are just setting off. They've just come through Martigny, which he describes as the most wretched place you could possibly imagine, which I think is either horribly unfair on Martigny, or Martigny has had a significant glow up in the last 250 years. But yeah, there we are, Captain Coignet. So he's going to be with us our whole way. I will let you know what he thinks of various situations. And I would say let's go, but I'm actually just going to have a coffee and eat some banana cake. And then I'm going to go. So I'm just taking a quick breather inside this cave, as you do. And Oh my God, I've just noticed how incredibly hot and sweaty and red in the face I look. And I'm just imagining my mum watching this. Oh, darling, how can you look so horrible on camera? Sorry, Mum, it is what it is. Anyway, I wanted to say what's really cool is coming to a place where you've been planning it for months and then you are in the bit you've been reading about in the guidebook. And I remember reading this stuff about climbing up through a boulder field and sort of having to follow these daubs of yellow paint so that you don't get lost. And that's what I've been doing. And it's amazing to actually be here doing it. And it's great fun. And also thinking a lot about the captain. I mean, I'm going to call him the captain from now on. I know he was not a captain when he was climbing over the Alps. He was a private, but I just can't. The French, it's just killing me. Every time a French person says bonjour to me, I panic. So let's just call him the captain from now on. Right. So the captain. How are him and his pals getting over any of this terrain, carrying artillery, is completely beyond me. There is a highway that I'm kind of walking alongside, and it is actually incredibly noisy. So although this walk is incredibly beautiful, it is quite car noisy. So I trained for this on the North Downs Way in Kent, in England, and that is also kind of near the M25. So I feel like I'm slightly used to road noise. And when you're old and doing this alone like me, the idea that you're never more than a limp away from being able to hitchhike your way to Geneva is not uncomforting. But I am quite looking forward to when they go in the tunnel properly and only the tourist cars remain on the highway going up to the pass. Because, yeah, audibly, this is not the bucolic ideal I was hoping for. So I'm about 3 kilometres outside Bourg-St-Pierre, which is where things were about to get really, really tough for the captain and the rest of the army. So up to this point, you know, it's been grueling, it's been difficult. Up to this point, Napoleon has been on a horse, right? It's still passable by a horse. From Bourg-St-Pierre, that's where he has to change to his mule. And that's where the business of getting these massive cannon over the mountains becomes a real issue. Obviously, there hasn't been an army that's crossed the Alps since Charlemagne, but Charlemagne didn't have these massive cannon. There were 8-pounders and 4-pounders. So they had to devise a method to get them over the pass, which when they were crossing in May was still icy and snow-covered. So Auguste de Marmont, who was the head of the artillery of this reserve army, of which the captain was the part, devised these massive sledges which they dragged the cannon over the mountain on by hand. So according to Andrew Roberts, there were 100 men at a time hauling these sledges. Now, I think the captain might well have been on a smaller cannon. So he talks about this as, here in Saint-Pierre, we dismounted our entire park in the presence of the consul. Each of our pieces was placed in a trough. At the end of the trough, there was a large mortice by which to drag our piece, managed by a strong and intelligent gunner with 40 grenadiers under his orders. We had to obey in absolute silence every movement made by his piece. If he commanded halt, we could not budge. If he cried advance, we had to move on. He was our master. And they're going to set off the next morning from Bourg-St-Pierre up to Grand Saint-Bernard. And they have to go as early as they can possibly manage because later in the day, avalanches are more likely. So they're all, I should imagine, pretty terrified and pretty nervous about the day ahead. And for the captain, there is at least one disaster about to happen. A lot of the time out here, it really does feel like you're just walking through a postcard. It's insane. So I'm just coming in to Bourg-St-Pierre, and there on the left is my hotel, which I am really very glad to see. I'm completely exhausted. And tomorrow is the big day for me, the big day for the captain, who had to haul the cannon up those hills. I'm not entirely sure which hills. Navigation is not my strong suit. Another reason why I chose a long walk which was brilliantly signposted. I just follow the signs. Like the captain following his master, who says halt when he must halt and advance when he must advance. Anyway, rambling. I think I need to go and find a nice cold drink and a nice big bed. So I'm in Bourg-St-Pierre, and look at this. Absolute shivers. Napoleon stayed here in this house the day before he marched his army over the Alps. Isn't that amazing? So here is Bourg-St-Pierre. Quiet, peaceful, ravishing in fact, but not so in May 1800. By the time the captain and Napoleon got here on the 20th of May, the army had already been passing through since the 14th. Napoleon was a little to the rear of the advance party, making sure that all the logistics were working. It was here that the last preparations were made to men and equipment before the push to the summit. Here the guns were mounted on their vast sledges. Here that Napoleon swapped from the horse made famous in the David paintings to a less salubrious mule. As the captain said, the entire village was composed entirely of barracks covered with planks and immense barns where we slept pell-mell. And the captain had thought that Martigny was a pretty wretched place. As far as he was concerned, Bourg-St-Pierre was like a snowy hell. So Napoleon wrote the people of Bourg-St-Pierre an IOU letter to the tune of some 34,000 gold francs. Now, it is highly unlikely that Napoleon ever had much intention of paying that, but I'm going to show you something so cool. Are you ready? There it is. There is the IOU letter from Napoleon to the people of Bourg-St-Pierre from May 1800. And that's not the end of the story, because periodically for the next 150 years, the people of Bourg-St-Pierre went to the French government with their IOU note for 39 or 34,000 gold francs and said, where is our money? Invariably, they were told to bug off, and they left empty-handed. Now, in 1984, they tried President Mitterrand. And President Mitterrand was not really that keen to give them all the money either, because with compound interest, it was now, the debt incurred was like tens of millions of francs or euros. So, President Mitterrand wrote them a rather nice letter, which you can see here, congratulating them for being so lovely to Napoleon as he walked through, and giving them this, a commemorative medal to mark Napoleon's journey over the Alps. There he is, on his horse, climbing up from Bourg-St-Pierre. And the mayor of Bourg-St-Pierre thought, oh, well, do you know what? Maybe we're never going to get this money back. So he wrote President Mitterrand a very gracious letter to say thank you. By the way, I'm not filming completely crookedly. The letter from the mayor has slipped down in its protective casing. And this is on a wonderful display outside the town hall. And there is the pass before the road, I think. And that pass is where the captain hauled up his cannon, where I am going to haul up my slightly already knackered. Welcome to day 3 of my walk with Napoleon. To be honest, it's the day I was a bit scared of. Anyway, I've just been filling up water in these amazing fountains. I'm standing outside the house Napoleon stayed in 1800. How cool is that? And although it's quite currently cloudy at the tops, it was sunny at daybreak, so I think it passes quite quickly, and I got my GPS. And they have St. Bernard dogs. Somebody will rescue you. So this is the captain talking about how he got his cannon where we've just been. So the evening before, his cannoneer had made up his teams, which were composed of 40 grenadiers to each piece, 20 to drag the piece, 10 on each side, holding onto sticks put through ropes which served for traces, and 20 others who carried the others' muskets and the wheels and caissons of the piece. The consul had taken the precaution to collect the mountaineers together for the purpose of picking up all the things which should have been left behind, promising them 6 francs for the journey and 2 rations a day. In this way, everything was brought together at the place of rendezvous and nothing was lost, although I wonder if Napoleon ever bloody paid. Anyway, one of the things Andrew Roberts talks about in his book is how that Napoleon was very considerate of the ordinary men, the privates and the corporals in his army. And that was one of his strengths as a general. And you can see that when you're reading The Captain. Every single time he gets anywhere near Bonaparte himself, he gets all starry and misty-eyed, and he's always talking about him sort of looking out for them. The next morning at daybreak, our master placed us by 20s at our pieces, 10 on each side of a gun. I was put in the first place, to the right, in front. It was the most dangerous side because it was next to the precipices. So this answers the question I had on the way up. Which side of the river gorge was the captain on? Well, he was obviously where the road is, because he was on the right at the edge of the cliff. Now, I'll just show you what that actually means in practice. So look, that's how steep it is. And that's with the proper road carved in. And all the way down the river gorge, that's what it was like. This incredibly sharp drop down into this raging river. And it was up those steep sides that the captain and his pals had to pull those bloody cannon. So as they'd left Bourg-St-Pierre that morning, they'd been issued rations, biscuits, army biscuits. Not very nice, but, needs must. And the captain had tied all his biscuits around his neck on a string, ease of access, and also because he thought they'd be safe. Now, when they stopped to change their boots, which had been cut to pieces by the ice, the captain went to have a biscuit. And then, poor sod, the string broke and all his biscuits fell from his neck down, over the precipice into the river below. And all his colleagues, because they're soldiers, their first reaction was to laugh themselves stupid at the sight of the poor captain watching his biscuits bounce into the river below. But then, also like soldiers everywhere, they decided to do the right thing and they each gave him a biscuit and everybody was happy again. But the poor captain, I think that was his worst moment of the whole trip, watching those biscuits bounce down the precipice. So I've been very lucky with the weather today, as was the captain and Napoleon, in fact. He had particularly good weather for the crossing. According to Andrew Roberts, only one of the gun crews was lost in an avalanche, which is pretty good odds for the army. Not great odds if you're one of that gun crew. But there we go. And actually, the bit that I've just done, the last few hundred feet, has been quite steep. But for the captain and his pals, it was actually easier going because they were in what they called the perpetual snowfields, which meant that the sledges that their guns were on were moving much more easily through the terrain than it had been further down the valley when they were struggling with the ice and the rocks and the terrible precipices of the river gorge. So up to about here had been a bit easier. I think for both of us, it's getting a little bit tougher. The last few hundred feet are very, very steep, which is why I've stopped to talk to you and eat some cheese. So the captain is feeling a lot better at this point because it's become a bit easier on the sledge and he's had his biscuits and he's got a new pair of shoes and everything's a little bit better. Just a little steep bit coming up here. We're at that stage in a hill walk where you always think that the end must be just round this next rock. And it never quite is. Yeah. Upwards. so I can see the monastery. Look, it's there. Can you see it? Hang on, there. Oh my goodness, what a sight that is. And I'm delighted for a few reasons. So, one is, I had read the diaries of Captain Cognier, obviously, before I came here, back in the safety of, and civilization of London, and I'd thought I'd understood how difficult it was what they did. But now I have like a visceral appreciation for what the captain and his brothers in arms did to get up here with all that gear and those bloody cannon. Honestly, I'd have just pushed the bloody cannon over the precipice, me. Not happening. So, I like to think that 225 years ago, the captain felt the same kind of elation that I just felt coming around that bend and seeing the monastery at the top of the hill. Incredible. The other reason I'm elated is because to train for this, I gave up drinking for a few months, about 3 or 4, so that I could get up and go to the gym every morning early, and I promised myself I would have a beer on top of that pass, and I'm nearly there, so I'm looking forward to that. On the other hand, I am also not really looking forward to it being over, because this has been one of the best walking days of my entire life. Just beautiful, inspiring, just amazing. So on the one hand, I don't want it to end. On the other hand, I want to get my boots off and have a beer. So, conflicted and elated. And there is the monastery and hospice of San Bernard, where I'm staying tonight. It's been providing refuge and help to travellers since the 11th century, when St Bernard, the Bishop of Aosta, down the Italian side of the valley, set it up. Napoleon stopped here for a few hours only on his way to Italy to refuel and recover. As for the captain, while the officers were entertained in the great hall with fires and feasts, he and his pals were billeted in the corridors. But they got a bucket of wine and a wheel of Gruyere cheese between 12 of them, and a loaf of bread each, so he was perfectly content. The hospice, however, did about as well as Bourg-St-Pierre out of Napoleon. It handed over 21,724 bottles of wine, 3,468 pounds of cheese, 748 pounds of salt, 400 pounds of rice, 500 pounds of bread, 1,758 pounds of meat. The total cost was 40,000 francs, and by 1850 they'd received less than half of that. Anyway, back to the captain. Well fed and well rested, it was time to cross into Italy. And if getting those sledges of cannon up was hard, getting them down was going to be epic. If getting me up was hard, getting me down, well, let's just see. So as the captain left the monastery, he could not find the words to express the veneration he felt for the monks who provide this place of shelter and warmth and hospitality on top of the mountain. And he pressed their hands to thank them, and he cuddled the San Bernard dogs. And heading off into this morning, and look at those lovely doors. Heading off into this morning. I hear you, Captain, I hear you. And just like that, sono in Italia! And there he is. Maybe because this is an Italian one rather than a French one, he looks a bit weedy. A little less than heroic. But Napoleon has crossed into Italy, and so have I. That's the pass beginning to open up into Italy. And that's the way I've come down from up there. And it's pretty steep. And as Andrew Roberts points out, bringing particularly the big guns down here, when all of this was covered in snow, or as the captain calls it, a perfect hellscape of snow, was quite something, because obviously the sledges would try and pick up their own momentum, so they were trying to hold them back. Now, the captain implies that the officers of his, unit volunteered to take their pieces down. And by the time they get to the bottom, to Saint-Remy, which is where I'm headed today, well, through Saint-Remy, but Saint-Remy, the officers' boots were gone and the sleeves of their coats had been torn off and they were in a right state. So there was a bit of egalite there. I think it's going to take me about 10 hours to do a 12-kilometre walk because I literally cannot stop stopping to look at this view and to film little bits and pieces that I will probably never use just because it's so endlessly beautiful. I can't stop stopping. That's the path I'm going down. I mean, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to stop stopping? So here we are arriving in Saint-Remy, which is pretty ravishing. And the captain and his pals were lucky enough to find a stable that they were allowed to sleep in Saint-Remy. And they were warm and safe and happy in that stable for the night, knowing that the worst of the mountains was over. I, on the other hand, am getting sadder that I'm leaving as I descend. And I'm hoping that Saint-Remy can furnish me with a consolatory ice cream. So I've just left the Troubler, and that's the way I'm going today. And the sun is just coming up over the top of the hills. And yeah, even though I'm absolutely gutted this is my last day of walking, I can see why the captain thought he was walking down into paradise. I'm in the little village of Guignon, just above Aosta. And it's the third town that I've passed that has a carnival every year in which the villagers dress up in replicas of Napoleon's soldiers' uniforms, but kind of replicas that are parodic. So they include lots of sort of ribbons and mirrors and whatever, while keeping the original colours of the Napoleonic uniform. Now, I saw one account which says that this was like a celebration of the crossing, and I saw another account which is more convincing to me that the reason that these uniforms that the villagers wear are kind of parodies of the original uniform is because they're taking the mickey out of something that frightens them. And if you think about what it was like for this tiny, sleepy part of the world when 50-odd thousand men, 10,000 horses and 750 mules came over those hills behind me, like locusts, eating everything, drinking everything, passing through, not really paying for anything. It was like a financial plague, I guess, on a small part of the world that wasn't used to being, central to history. And I think it's incredible that that moment kind of has such a mythic quality in this region that every year they go out in their costumes. So I've come to the end of my journey, but it's not all bad because I'm drinking a beer in the Forum of Augustus. Look, you can see the columns there. I'm in Aosta. And it's quite apt that I'm here because I've been thinking a lot about great men and how they attempt to outdo each other, how the echoes of the great man before them spur them on to their sort of narcissistical ambitions. And when Napoleon was in San Bernardo Monastery, according to Adam Zamoyski's book, he pulled out a copy of Livy from the library and went straight to the chapter on Hannibal crossing the Alps. Napoleon, as both Roberts and Zamoyski make clear, was obsessed with the great men who came before him, and it was part of what gave him his sense of mission. So that leads obviously to thoughts about the little people who get sacrificed on that altar of all those great men's shadows tumbling together to kind of create this impetus to be ever more brilliant and ever more bold and ever more dominating. And we don't need to look very far in examples of our own, world of where great men's vaulting ambitions can be very difficult to live with. I mean, we only need to look as far as Putin rehabilitating Stalin and, putting up statues of him all over Moscow to understand what that looks like. But I also think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think little men want to have lives that feel great to them too. So if you look at someone like the captain, he would have had a very dreary, awful life. He had a terrible childhood. He was working as a servant when he got into the army. And instead, he did extraordinary things that he was proud of. And he, met Napoleon, who he worshipped. And it's interesting, actually, because we have to obviously take his memoir with a pinch of salt. He wrote it at the age of 71. But as he's looking back, there are some things that we can take on trust. So we can take on trust what it feels like to watch your biscuits fall down the ravine. We can take on trust what it feels like to venerate those monks who live a life of service up on that mountain, waiting to welcome people in from the cold and the storms. And we can take on trust the fact that the moments where he met Napoleon were transcendental for him. So very soon after reaching Aosta, he goes down into Piedmont and he fights in his first battle at a place called Montebello. And he is personally thanked and rewarded by the emperor. And it means something to him. So, yes, great men can trample on small lives, but some of those small lives gain a lot of meaning from being caught up in history too. Anyway, a small note of housekeeping before I go. Please, if you've got it this far, you must like what I've done. So do like and comment, because it makes a huge difference to, I don't know, the YouTube algorithms. God, it's so boring to be talking about it, but yeah, I've gone from great men to YouTube mechanics. But do like, do comment. It makes such a difference, I promise you. So please do that. And in the meantime, I would just like to say, as I bid a fond farewell to the captain and a slightly less fond, slightly more ambiguous farewell to Napoleon, thank you for coming on the journey with me.